The documentary you are about to see chronicles the story of a Maroon settlement of escaped Brazilian slaves, and how they survived for 93 years, while the Portuguese and Dutch tried for decades to crush their settlements. Set in 17th century Brazil, it tells the story of the rise and fall of the Quilombos of Palmares, where a group of escaped slave settlements developed into a functioning sovereignty, fending off attacks by the Portuguese and Dutch, and led by their greatest leader and war chief, Zumbi dos Palmares. The Palmares story is important because of many incredibly powerful elements. It tells a story about slavery, rebellion, heroism, betrayal, politics, economics, and tragedy. It is in effect a classic story concerning the struggle and fight for freedom and equality. After more than a year's research of major writers and secondary sources on the subject, we realized that only selected portions of the history of Palmares had actually been told. Also, we discovered there are some discrepancies between the Brazilian and Dutch versions of events. For this reason, we decided to publish this documentary and include many previously unreported facts. Something should be said about our efforts to reach out to a number of Brazilian historians and intellectuals concerning interviews. While some declined our request for an interview, others did not respond. The study of Maroon sites is a rich and virtually untapped area that has the potential of advancing our knowledge of enslaved Africans, native Brazilians, Jews, Moors, and Brazilians of mixed heritage. We hope that you will find the story of Palmares interesting, informative, and enlightening.
In 1601, a group of enslaved Central Africans escaped their slaveholders and fled to the heavily forested hills that parallel the northeastern coast of Brazil. With the protection of thick tropical terrain, they were able to establish settlements that would grow into large communities. These settlements became known as the Quilombos of Palmares. Palmares was situated in the mountains where there was an abundance of palm trees, thus the name Palmares. In this region of great forests, there were a number of different villages built along the mountain ranges. It was very difficult to access these villages, between the mountains and forests, which made it an excellent location for hiding. This area itself was extensive, and almost all of the inhabitants of the Quilombos were slaves that escaped from nearby cities, farms, and plantations, and found their way to Palmares, or were brought there by other slaves. The inhabitants of Palmares organized themselves into a complex ecosystem by adapting to the local geography in areas similar to the savannas of the African plateaus. Although they were dispersed across a large geographic area, they developed a system of communication between villages with complementary activities. There were two major types of settlements, Greater Palmares and Little Palmares. Careful and suspicious, they would send out spies to look for enemies during the daytime and posted sentries at night. Behind their villages were situated their provision grounds, where they grew coconuts, beans, potatoes, corn, sugar cane, and other crops. Some of the smaller villages consisted of only about 200 houses, with a church and a large meeting hall. The settlements of Greater Palmares were more heavily fortified and contained thousands of families and inhabitants. The heavily fortified village of Zumbi, for example, was said to have thousands of inhabitants, with 3 gates and platforms, each guarded by a garrison and a captain. There were a number of other heavily fortified quilombos, such as Aquiltine, Subipira, and Macaco. All in all, the villages of Palmares totaled 9 different settlements. The inhabitants of Palmares were effective in mastering the fauna and flora of the mountain ranges, and got their fish from rivers, and their meat from hunting. Their agricultural economy, with its growing population, produced agricultural surplus, which they marketed and exchanged with nearby small farmers and villages. They exchanged flour, palm wine, butter, firearms, gunpowder, tools, and anything else that was needed for their settlements. They established workshops for making clothes, shoes, nets, mats, pots, and other items that were needed for survival. For almost 3 decades, the Quilombos of Palmares experienced a number of important developments in its evolution. For one, it became a centralized kingdom, with a ruler, who was elected to office, and delegated authority. Zumbi, who was born in the Quilombos a free man, was its greatest king, and war chief. He was the son of Sabina, the sister of Gonga Zumba, who was the son of Princess Aquiltune, who was the daughter of the king of the Congo, in Africa. Apparently, the Portuguese were successful in winning a battle in Africa, by killing some 5,000 warriors, and capturing the king, members of his family, governors, court officials, and other noblemen, who were put on ships and sold as slaves in Brazil. When Palmares was established, Gonga Zumba became its first king, and Zumbi was his nephew. In Palmares, the most important offices went to relatives, and Zumbi was a member of the African royal family. Zumbi was appointed war chief, and his brother, Gonga Zona, was in charge of the Palmares arsenal. At the early age of 6 years old, Zumbi was captured by the Portuguese, and given to a Catholic missionary. There, he was baptized, given the name Francisco, learned Latin and Portuguese, and was educated. Despite attempts to subjugate him, Zumbi escaped at the age of 15, and returned to his people. He became known for his prowess in battle, and was a respected military strategist, by the time he was in his early 20s. The inhabitants of Palmares selected their officials from people who had a lot of experience, and they obeyed their officials with reverence and respect. The regime of the Palmares chieftains was strict, and offenses such as murder, robbery, and adultery were swiftly punished with death. In addition to officials that administered justice, there were others who were responsible for administering wars. Indeed, the Quilombos of Palmares came very close to altering the subsequent history of the country of Brazil.
The story of Palmares as a historical classic of Brazilian literature is important for 2 distinct reasons. First, it was of considerable interest to the Brazilian Historical Institute in 1840, which initiated discussions and prompted serious search for materials about Palmares, well into 1851. Second, it is not just that Palmares was a settlement of escaped slaves that survived for a very long period of time, but more important, it was a functioning African state, within the sovereign country of Brazil, with a ruler who was elected to office, a system of laws, religion, and social structure, and with its own specialized labor, trade, commerce, communications, agriculture, and defense.
There is considerable evidence that at least some of the settlements of Palmares had small churches. As to whether those churches were Catholic, syncretic, or places of worship to African gods, no one really knows. Enslaved Africans that were shipped from Portuguese African ports were required to be baptized as Christians before embarking, and were branded with a cross to show they had been baptized and their taxes to the crown had been paid. When slaves arrived in Brazil, they arrived in totally Catholic surroundings, and there were many instances of syncretism between Catholic and popular African beliefs and customs. It should not be surprising then that escaped slaves took those syncretic beliefs with them. However, several Brazilian historians are of the opinion that the religion of the inhabitants of Palmares was similar to Catholicism. The earliest accounts of any form of industrial activity in Palmares mentions various different types of craftsmen among the inhabitants. In fact, an early report from a government official stated that the inhabitants had iron and tools at their disposal with which they were able to forge weapons. It was well known that the territory occupied by the inhabitants of Palmares had large deposits of iron and nitrate, making it possible for them to create weapons for defense. But more important, it also indicates that the inhabitants knew some type of work division whereby craftsmen were able to make sickles, hammers, machetes, and other iron works. In addition, there are indications they made earthenware, pots, wooden utensils, and domestic utensils. It is further believed that there were 4 distinct groups of work division: farmers, craftsmen, warriors, and public servants. Although these craftsmen and blacksmiths specialized in repairing different types of iron works, many of them also worked in other areas to sustain the livelihood and survival of their settlements. In addition, there were several different types of relationships between the inhabitants of Palmares and local inhabitants of the colony. For one, there was extensive trade between the inhabitants, local farmers, and villagers of the coastal villages. Also, local small farmers derived advantages by establishing good relations with the inhabitants, such as avoiding their goods being stolen, and when slaves escaped from local farms and fled to Palmares, they were returned to the local farmers. Equally, the local farmers were helpful in supplying advance information of military expeditions that were prepared against them and their settlements. As a result, the inhabitants and local farmers had good working relationships, and it remained so, as long as the inhabitants of the Quilombos did not encroach on the free lands near the local farmers. Although it is suspected that there were earlier arrivals, the first known arrivals of enslaved Africans to Brazil appears to have been in the mid-16th century. The establishment of Palmares, however, took place about 1601, which predates the Dutch in Brazil by at least 25 years. It seems the first mention of Palmares appears around 1604, when the governor of Pernambuco learned from a Brazilian Indian chief of a settlement of escaped slaves. Apparently, the Indian chief was hired to destroy the settlement and return with slaves. However, few were brought back, because most of them were killed during the attack. The inhabitants of Little Palmares amounted to a few thousand people, living in simple huts made from grass and twigs, with provision grounds situated behind them, where they grew crops. It is generally accepted that the settlements of Palmares grew to about 20,000 inhabitants. Palmares maintained its true strength by providing food, as well as security for its inhabitants, with large tracts of land, where they were able to plant almost every kind of vegetable, and they knew how to store them, for both wintertime and war. A Dutch army lieutenant, Jurgens Reinbach, during a military expedition, described Palmares in the following way.
This Palmares is equally half a mile long, its street 6 feet wide, and running along a large swamp, with tall trees alongside. There are about 200 houses, a midsummer church, 4 smithies, and a huge council house, and all kinds of artifacts are to be seen. We asked the Negroes how many of them lived there, and were told some 500, and from what we saw around us, We presumed that there were at least 1,500 inhabitants all told. This is the Greater Palmares, of which so much is heard in Brazil, with its well-kept lands, all kinds of cereals, beautifully irrigated, and with streamlets.
When we consider the cultural background of the founders of Palmares, we find that since the late 16th century, well into the 17th century, many of them originated within the Angola-Congo perimeter in Africa. Also, in Pernambuco, in 1601, there could not have been many Criollos, or first-generation mixed bloods, born in Brazil from Portuguese parentage. What is certain is the inhabitants of Palmares were Bantu-speaking, but not exclusive to any one subgroup. It is also certain that at this time, the majority of slaves imported through the capital city of Pernambuco had a Bantu background, and it is not surprising they cut across different ethnic lines. Between the early 15th century and the mid-1800s, Angola was a leading exporter of enslaved Africans. It was a major Central African port where nearly 6 million captives embarked for the Americas. In 1483, a Portuguese crown-sponsored expedition landed on the Zaire River and established diplomatic and commercial relations with the King of the Congo. Soon after, the Portuguese began exporting enslaved Africans to the Iberian Peninsula and to the American colonies. Also, the Portuguese began exporting slaves to the newly settled islands of São Tomé and Príncipe in the eastern Atlantic Ocean. By 1530, as many as 5,000 enslaved Africans were shipped from the Central African port of Mpenda each year. The Portuguese managed to acquire enslaved Africans through trade, collecting tribute from vassals, and by launching punitive military campaigns against the Mbundu people. As a result, the founders of Palmares must have been Bantu-speaking, and could not have belonged to any one single cultural subgroup. Nor is it surprising that the inhabitants of Palmares cut across different ethnic lines culturally, and was made up of those slaves who managed to escape from various different plantations at different times. It is evident that Palmares was not a single social structure, but a settlement that governed a plural society and provided continuity to various ethnic groups of otherwise scattered escaped slaves. Portuguese governor Francisco G. Brito Favre stated in 1675.
Tespeca linguagem isto sometimes resembles to language of Guinea or Angola, sometimes Portuguese or to language of the Tupi Indians, but they do not speak their own, new language.
Research conducted by Brazilian archaeologist and anthropologist, Dr. Pedro Paulo Funari, suggests that Palmares was a pluralistic society, not comprised of just enslaved African runaways. In fact, recognition of the importance of Palmares, and certain shortcomings on the part of some documentation, prompted the formation of the Palmares Archaeological Project in 1992, under the direction of Dr. Charles Ossa, Jr., and Dr. Pedro Paulo Funari. The material evidence found as a result of this archaeological project revealed that the Maroon culture of Palmares was comprised of a combination of African, European, poor white, native Brazilians, Ama-Indian, and indigenous Tupi-Guarani elements.
Now, the move away from the coast, and more toward the inland of Brazil, began in 1650 with the states of Bahia, Sergipe, and Espírito Santo. Not long after, the northern states such as Alagoas and Pernambuco followed. Although good relations existed between the local farmers and the inhabitants of Palmares, they were contingent upon an understanding that the slave settlements would not encroach upon the free lands used by the local farmers. However, this agreement was not something that Portuguese authorities viewed from the perspective of the local farmers, who had contact with the inhabitants. Also, all of the local farmers were not in agreement, as some large plantation owners formed small private armies and made incursions into Palmares territory to recapture lands or acquire new lands without having to pay for them. It also seems evident that the loss of plantation slaves through raids and escape emerged as a primary reason that escalated the conflict between plantation owners and the inhabitants of Palmares. More important, by 1660, the price of slaves had increased considerably, and the idea of a settlement where slaves could escape to freedom created an incentive for slaves to attempt escape. As time passed, government officials began to succumb to the pressure from plantation owners. One government official wrote to Portugal,
"Property owners of this captaincy, Your Majesty, are not capable of doing much by themselves in this war. At all hours they complain to me of tyrannies they must suffer from the Negroes of Palmares."
Eventually, the Quilombos of Palmares became regarded as a serious threat to both the political order and plantation system of the Portuguese. In time, these issues became the inducements for launching a series of military campaigns to destroy the fugitive slave settlements of Palmares.
As you can see, the country of Brazil began to expand inland, with the states of Bahia, Sergipe, Espírito Santo, Alagoas, and Pernambuco, and the alliances formed between the inhabitants of Palmares and local farmers were not acknowledged, nor were they accepted by Portuguese authorities. Also, some larger plantation owners formed small armies to invade some areas of Palmares in order to recapture lands. As a result, conflicts between large plantation owners and the inhabitants of Palmares began and escalated. In time, government officials succumbed to pressure from large plantation landowners to do something about the settlements of Palmares.
For several decades before the Dutch conquered Brazil, slaves escaping into the jungle regions were considered a problem. The first report of a Portuguese expedition against Palmares appears in 1612 and shows that very little was accomplished in terms of any military victory. A high Portuguese military officer wrote,
"Some 30 leagues inland, there is a site between mountains called Palmares, which harbors runaway slaves, whose attacks and raids force the whites into armed pursuits, which amount to little, for they return to raid again. This makes it impossible to end the transgressions."
Nothing else is reported concerning military expeditions against Palmares until the mid-1630s. This is after the Dutch conquered Brazil, and when small farmers began to complain about Palmares, describing it as a great calamity. Then, by the 1640s, the Dutch viewed Palmares as a serious danger and began to increase their militancy toward the settlements. On more than one occasion, bandeirantes were used to fight against the inhabitants of Palmares. These consisted of small armies of mercenaries and pacified indigenous Indians who fought at their own risk. These Indians were never paid in money. Their earnings usually came from the spoils of war. Goods captured in military expeditions would be kept, escaped slaves would be resold, and the military commanders would share in the profits from these sales. When there was some kind of reward, it consisted of acres of captured land, usually the very same land that the inhabitants of Palmares lived on. When an expedition was completed, the commanders returned to the capital city of Pernambuco and reported to the governor. The governor in turn wrote to the Portuguese crown that the expedition had been a great success. He gave the number of people killed and taken prisoner, and how much of the booty was for the crown. Commanders of military expeditions were usually required to hand in a journal of their expedition to a governmental secretary. These journals were usually very detailed, and are the documentation by which expeditions can be historically followed, even until the present. By means of such journals, commanders were able to provide information on where they made contact, how the villages were positioned, and a description of weapons and provisions. Then in 1643, the West India Company sent an Amerindian commander with a force of Tapuya Indians and several Dutch regulars to destroy the larger Palmares with fire and sword. In the Dutch military expedition of 1645, a scout brought back a report, stating that Palmares was not just one settlement, but several, containing some 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants, living in numerous huts. Also, he stated that the smaller settlements were clustered about 20 kilometers from the state of Alagoas, and the larger ones were some 30 kilometers deeper inland, in the mountain region of Serra de Barriga. Situated about 30 kilometers from the city of Santo Amaro, at the base of the Boho mountain, lived about 5,000 inhabitants, in scattered houses built at the entrance of the forest, with exits to flee, and reach hiding places, if danger threatened. A second Dutch expedition was launched in 1645, and it was headed by an army lieutenant, who kept a diary for 36 consecutive days. His task was to destroy the greater Palmares settlements. His journal entry reads as follows. When we arrived, the bush gross was so thick, that it took mich doigt to cut a pastro. Or Brazilian guide managed to kill 2 or 3 negros, in the bush, but most of the people had vanished. Their king knew of the expedition for some time, because they had been forewarned from Alagoas. In military terms, this expedition succeeded in accomplishing no better than the expeditions prior to it. However, the ensuing 2 decades became a period of sustained warfare. In the early 1630s, Dutch troops landed in Brazil near the city of Olinda, modern-day Recife. Almost immediately, the capital and surrounding areas were captured rather quickly. In the years that followed, the Dutch expanded their territory toward the interior of Pernambuco, more and more at the expense of the Portuguese. By 1636, the Dutch had complete control of the entire area, north of Salvador, Bahia. When the Dutch captured Paraíba, in 1635, this gave them complete control of the coastal area, and enabled them to develop and extend commercial trade. Although the large Dutch ships were unable to moor in the coastal inlets, like the lighter Portuguese ships, still their capture of the area enabled them to control the sugar cane trade. After several years of open warfare, the Dutch finally withdrew in 1654. However, they were instrumental in contributing added scientific knowledge about the territory. In 1637, Johan Maurits van Nassau, the Dutch governor of Pernambuco, brought along with him a number of scientists and painters from Europe. Maurits was accompanied by 2 painters, Post and Eckhout, who painted the New World, 2 scientists, Piso and Mark Graf, who went into the interior where they studied diseases and Indian ways of healing, and acquired information on over 1,400 different kinds of tropical plants and animals. Later in 1647, a book about Maurits' period of office was printed. However, only a few copies of the book remain. As mentioned earlier, the inhabitants of Palmares and local small farmers had a reciprocal relationship. Farmers were not annoyed by the inhabitants of Palmares, and they lived in relative peace, as long as the inhabitants kept their settlements, and their fields for provisions, away from the free lands, that were used by local farmers. Some of the farmers were known to trade firearms and weapons with the inhabitants, for goods and provisions. In 1670, after the Portuguese had regained control of Brazil, the governor established a proclamation, bitterly denouncing farmers that possessed firearms, and passed them on to the inhabitants of Palmares. By 1687, the state of Pernambuco passed a law that called for the imprisonment of local farmers, suspected of relations with Palmares, irrespective of their station. In spite of the law, farmers were still useful in supplying advance information on military expeditions that were prepared against the settlements. The main problem for the inhabitants of Palmares, local farmers, and Portuguese authorities, was the lands considered free by inhabitants and local farmers were not regarded in the same way by Portuguese authorities.
Research shows that expeditions against Palmares began as early as 1612. However, for more than 15 years afterward, there is no record of any military activity. By 1640, the Dutch also began to view Palmares as a threat, and on several occasions, Brazilian mercenaries were used to fight against the inhabitants of Palmares. Somewhere around 1643, several different expeditions were conducted. Also, relations between the inhabitants of Palmares and Portuguese authorities deteriorated to the extent that, for the next 2 decades there was constant warfare.
By 1678, the governor of Pernambuco, weary of long-standing conflict with Palmares, approached the king of Palmares, Donga Zumba, the uncle of Zumbi, with an offer of freedom for all runaway slaves. This offer was contingent upon the requirement that the inhabitants of Palmares would submit to Portuguese authority. From the beginning, Zumbi realized it was a trick. Zumbi had been educated by the Catholic monks and spoke Portuguese. He knew the government did not have authority to offer freedom because the runaway slaves were owned by individual civilians, not the government. By this time, Zumbi had become commander-in-chief of Palmares forces, and he was distrustful of the Portuguese offer of freedom. Further, Zumbi refused to accept freedom for the people of Palmares, while other Africans remained enslaved. He was famously quoted for saying, "If one of us is chained, then none of us are free." However, rejecting the governor's order caused conflict between Zumbi and his uncle the king, Donga Zumba. Donga Zumba was tired of fighting and decided to accept the governor's offer. As a result, Donga Zumba and an entourage of people from Palmares left the settlements to live among the Portuguese. While living among the Portuguese, Donga Zumba, the king of Palmares, was poisoned, and his followers fled and returned to Palmares. Later, Zumbi became the new king of Palmares and implemented a far more aggressive resistance toward the Portuguese. For the next 15 years, and under the kingship of Zumbi, tensions between Portuguese authorities and Palmares escalated.
By 1678, the governor of Pernambuco offered the king of Palmares, Donga Zumba, an offer of peace. Later, it was discovered that this peace treaty was only a deception by Portuguese authorities, and it caused division among the inhabitants of Palmares. Unfortunately, a large contingent of the inhabitants left Palmares along with their king, Donga Zumba, to live among the Portuguese. This decision proved to be fatal for the king of Palmares, who was found dead from poisoning, and which caused his followers to escape and return once again to the safety of the Quilombos. Once again, war with the Portuguese began and continued for another 16 years, when the Quilombos were destroyed and Zumbi dos Palmares was wounded and executed.
By 1675, attacks against Palmares grew more fierce, when an expedition discovered a large settlement with more than 2,000 houses. After 2.5 hours, the soldiers conquered the settlement, and took some 70 inhabitants as prisoners. Then in 1677, the governor of Pernambuco hired the mercenary Fernão Carrilho, who with a small contingent of soldiers, whites, mestizos, and Indians, came across one of the settlements of Palmares, where the mother of Zumbi lived. Some time later, a patrol discovered a road that led to a large settlement. A bloody fight ensued, leaving a number of inhabitants dead, and one of the Palmares military leaders was captured. Other troops conquered a settlement with about 1,000 houses. In this village, 2 children, several cousins and nephews of the king of Palmares, Gonga Zumba, were taken prisoner. Also, at this battle, it was reported that during the attack, the son of Gonga Zumba had been killed. In the opinion of the governor, Pedro G. Almeida, the inhabitants of Palmares had been beaten, and it was at this time he offered them peace. On the basis of several general accounts, which were published by Fonseca and Rodriguez, that reconstructed the period between 1678 through 1697, various expeditions were sent to Palmares. What these authors made clear is that in 1678, the inhabitants of Palmares still had not been beaten, as Governor Pedro G. Almeida previously thought. In fact, the people of Palmares continued to struggle, at least until about 1694, when Zumbi's village of Macaco was conquered and destroyed. When the new governor arrived replacing Almeida, a council of state convened for the purpose of offering Palmares king, Gonga Zumba, a peace treaty. An envoy was sent to Palmares with this treaty, and Gonga Zumba, after many years of fighting, decided to accept the agreement. On paper, the treaty seemed to be conclusive. However, the ink was hardly dry, when the governor began to distribute land that was part of the Palmares settlements, to individuals who had taken part in wars against Palmares. By 1679, Zumbi revolted against the treaty, and the war with Palmares commenced once again. It was believed that the offer of a treaty by the previous governor Almeida was not authentic, but a tactical move, because there were clauses in the agreement that could not be fulfilled. First, to allow a sovereign state to exist in Pernambuco would have meant a reversal of the policy of exclusive claim to Brazil. Second, to hand over 15,000 to 20,000 people from Palmares to the Portuguese would have been a difficult logistical problem for the leaders of Palmares. And finally, Palmares had long been considered a threat against the Portuguese economic and political order. From 1680 to 1686, 6 more expeditions were sent into Palmares, causing a cumulative loss of millions of cruzados to the state of Pernambuco. At the end of 1686, Palmares stood undefeated, and it became evident that the state of Pernambuco could not deal with Palmares out of its own resources. In 1687, the new governor informed Lisbon that the state of Pernambuco had accepted the services of mercenaries from São Paulo. These mercenaries were Portuguese, Indian, mestizos, and frontiersmen, renowned for special skills in jungle warfare. Their leader, Domingos Jorge Velho, had written to the governor of Pernambuco asking for commissions as commander-in-chief and captains, in order to subdue the inhabitants of Palmares. In crossing such a great geographic distance, the mercenaries did not reach Pernambuco until 1692, with lives lost in the backlands of Brazil, and over 200 men deserting, due to hunger, thirst, and agony. The story of the final destruction of Palmares has been told in great detail, with over two-thirds of secondary resources discussing what happened. With the assistance of forces from the states of Alagoas, Bahia, Piauí, and Pernambuco, in addition to the use of artillery, the mercenaries fought for 2 years to reduce Palmares to a single fortified settlement. February 1694, with a fierce battle, hundreds of people from Palmares throwing themselves off rocks, and hundreds of both sexes, all ages, becoming captured, and later sold outside of Pernambuco. Their leader, Zumbi dos Palmares, was wounded, captured, and later, executed.
Based on several sources, it is possible to reconstruct how Palmares came to its final end. However, the sources of some of the stories are rare, information is frequently repeated, and in some places, it actually contradicts itself. One well-known source, De Rocha Peter, states that in the final war with the mercenary, Domingos Jorge Velho, Zumbi, the leader of the Palmares, together with his main co-warriors, were cornered, and threw themselves off high mountain rocks, to their deaths in 1694. Yet, based on records from Dr. Morio Berin in 1696, the statement that Zumbi had thrown himself off rocks, when his village, Makoko, was seized, could not be true. Records show that in March 1696, the governor of Pernambuco wrote to Lisbon that Zumbi had been killed when a mulatto, who had been taken prisoner, led Domingos Jorge Velho to the village of Zumbi, where a small force of inhabitants were overcome, and Zumbi was captured and beheaded. Another example exists in the 1859 magazine article, in the Revista Trimensal, of the Brazilian Institute of History, Geography and Ethnology, which was reprinted in 1988. In this record, we find that in 1674, the new governor of Pernambuco stated that, if the Maroons would behave themselves as faithful vassals of the king and its governor, with humility like the Indians and poor whites, there would be no objection to their existence. However, as a political, social, and military unit, Palmares had to be destroyed. The problem with this account is, at that particular time, the troops of the governor only amounted to about 400 soldiers, and were far too few to conquer Palmares, in order to destroy it. Most historians, with regard to enslaved Africans in Brazil, focus on assimilation rather than divergence, and frequently, accounts of early colonial Brazil, come from the Dutch and Portuguese. As a result, active slave resistance has not received as much comparable attention and is considerably less known. However, it is important to point out that if the Portuguese had succumbed to the threat of Palmares, they might well have found themselves hugging the coast of northeast Brazil and facing a number of independent African states, dominating the interior of the country. Although other Quilombo settlements were established on Brazilian soil, none ever duplicated the accomplishments of Palmares, especially in terms of a centralized kingdom, with an elected ruler.